season because he was a stand-up comedian and he was an actor and he was a game show host and he is the color commentator for UFC. There's a lot of folks about which you can say the first three. That fourth one is a little unusual. I mean, it's probably been a decade since he hasn't been color commentator on a UFC MMA match.
I want to say he was there within the first 50 matches.
He might have been,
UFC.
Yeah.
I mean, he was incredibly early on brought
Absolutely.
in.
He's been doing it
because he's been doing martial arts since he was 15 years old.
Yeah, right.
He's a lifelong martial arts practitioner, and so he sort of was a natural fit for...
And he's won like national titles
Right.
and state titles in Taekwondo and kickboxing. So he's this guy that's done all these different things. And he got into podcasting pretty early as well. December 3rd, 2009 was the first show. And it's always been what it is now, which is a really long-form interview show. It's a little bit like WTF with Mark Maron, but it's even more long-form. And he deep dives in with these people in a way that if you see them as a guest on a TV show or on a panel, you're just not going to have that kind of in-depth conversation. The two episodes that we had you listen to were actually both from 2017. We just thought they'd be two interesting characters who might also each represent a very different worldview. And I don't know, maybe you'll tell us you thought they were a little bit similar. Before we dive in, I am going to ask you one tradition that remains because, Doug, without tradition, it would be chaos. Which did you listen to first? One was from August 2nd of 2017. That was the Ben Shapiro. And then the Russell Brand was October 5th. Here's the amazing thing. That is what? 8 weeks apart?
Right.
They're 28 episodes apart.
Yeah.
8 weeks, 28 fucking episodes.
He sometimes will release 2 episodes in a day.
Sure.
Because he also does
a lot of content.
Because he still does an MMA podcast as well as doing the Joe Rogan Experience.
And they just come out in the same stream.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
And so he's just got a lot of content. He likes to talk.
He does indeed. Doug, which one did you
I listened to
first?
Ben Shapiro first.
Okay. So you went in chronological order in this case, 993, which again, I mean, we know Joe Rogan, even if he's putting out a ton of content every week, you're at almost 1,000 episodes by that point. This dude's been doing this for a long, long time. What did you think before we even get to the huge amount of content that was provided by his guests, the thoughts and worldview of a Ben Shapiro? What did you think of the format? How familiar were you with Joe Rogan from any of his other projects before this?
So very familiar with Joe Rogan, not familiar with the podcast at all.
Okay.
So, I've heard, I don't think I've heard any of his stand-up recently, but definitely have heard it in the past.
Okay.
Knew him as an actor, knew him as an MMA commentator.
Right.
So just wasn't familiar with the podcast other than when he's done interviews about it.
Doug, we know you weren't familiar with the podcast.
Right. Yeah.
That's true. You're not familiar with any podcast.
Premise of the show.
Doug, was he someone you liked? Where you're like, I know of Joe Rogan and I like him. Like, oh, cool. I get to listen to a Joe Rogan podcast. Or is
I
someone
think
you're neutral on?
I don't know that. I guess I like him. I mean, I've enjoyed the interviews that I've heard with him. I think he's interesting, and so I was definitely expecting the podcast to be interesting.
Right.
I think that's kind of dictated by who your guests are and what they're talking about.
Sure.
So. There was the things that I don't like, but it was funny because in this case, like there was about a 10-minute intro that was basically just who all the sponsors were.
Oh, he does one commercial after another after another.
Right.
He does not break for them.
Yeah.
He just front loads fucking all of them. And then at the end, there's a ton of them. Yeah.
So actually, I want to jump in here because one of the things I was looking up, which is pretty interesting, is the way that they sell ads is there's pre-roll, mid-roll, and post-roll. Mm-hmm. And it's usually... you get the most money for a pre-roll ad. And so I'm thinking that maybe he preloads all those because it's like...
he's optimizing his income?
Yeah, because it's like I think that the structure is basically like per however many numbers of listens, you get that much money. So if it's like 1,000 listens, you get $18 per 1,000 listens. And so I can imagine that he wants to just have it so that he can maximize the amount of money. And he doesn't want to break in the middle because I also require editing, which he obviously doesn't do.
No,
in my opinion, there's no editing.
editing.
It's just pushing out, which is the only way you can get to 14 1,800 or
Absolutely.
1,200 episodes in
Post-production is nearly zero.
almost none, as far as I can tell. It's just
There's
pushing
no
out the
sound
episodes.
design, and we've listened to some shows that have exceedingly rich sound
Yeah.
design. There, you don't go 2 sentences without some kind of a sting or bumper or bed music.
Right.
There's none of that.
Nothing.
here.
It's just them talking, and
Right.
they don't even pause. Like not to get too far ahead, but the Russell Brand episode, Russell Brand gets up, goes to the bathroom, and then comes back.
Sure, it's at the
There's-
very end because he finally
Yeah.
has to after 2.5
Right.
hours. But yeah,
But
And
continue.
that was truly the only break in that. So in that 6 hour, experience for me, that was the only break. And then even at that time, he kept recording.
he
and
did.
Right,
Yeah.
was talking to his sound engineer about some stuff, or his producer, whoever it was. I was going to look up some info for him.
Right.
But what I was going to say is, it's a 3 hour podcast. So the payoff of it being free, because I listened to it on his website. And that was like I guess the quickest and easiest way. It popped right up, and I thought, yeah, I can just listen to it here. And that's what I did. So it doesn't bother me that there were 10 minutes of advertising, because somebody's got to pay the bills.
Sure.
And he's obviously, trying to
And you
also
could-
make money.
Since
So-
it's all the beginning, you can just kind of fast forward past it, and when you hear
you
the
get-
guest's voice, you go, "Okay, we're done."
Right. So yeah, it's it wasn't something that bothered me. Whereas on other podcasts, the preamble isn't so much about the advertising and making sure the lights are on. It's
Sure.
just rambling nonsense.
Right, like a Mark Maron style. This is what happened
Right.
in my week. This is who I'm dating. This is the town that I was just in to do 2 nights
Right.
of stand-up.
I didn't realize that I could use the Bluetooth on my car stereo to listen to a podcast.
Right. I mean, quality,
Yeah.
personal stories like
right.
that.
Not just rambling incoherence. You know?
No, as long
really
as it ties
focused.
into the podcast, it's all good.
Oh, Brandon, if we could only get paid during those first few minutes of the show, we wouldn't have to listen to Doug talk.
Oh,
about
we could roll our ads while Doug was talking. Oh, that's
Absolutely.
what we should 100%
Yeah, we
do.
could tell Doug.
There you go, right?
Yeah, just tell us. Oh no, that story's great. Keep going, and then just roll ads.
And then we just
over.
come
Hyundai,
in
are you
on
listening?
the punchline of Doug's story.
Absolutely. Oh, someday, guys.
One day.
Someday. Brandon, what about you? I know you obviously knew Joe Rogan well, and I suspect you were aware of the massive popularity, like the chart-topping popularity of this podcast. But had you listened to a lot of it?
So no, this is actually the first time I've ever listened to the Joe Rogan Experience.
Okay.
And of course, huge MMA fan, huge UFC fan, loved News Radio, which Joe Rogan was on. I didn't watch a lot of Fear Factor, but I also knew that Joe Rogan was the kind of guy who was very curious. He's a guy who likes to explore things. I knew
Right.
that he takes a ton of drugs. I watched a bunch of his stand-ups, and what he covers in his stand-up is very similar to what he talks about with his guests, it seemed. And so I kind of knew what I was in for to a degree. And I was the one who picked Ben Shapiro because I know that Ben Shapiro is a political figure. But I also didn't know what Joe Rogan's political beliefs were.
Well, he's a political commentary figure. He
Ben
himself
Shapiro.
is not a political figure.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly,
Ben
yes,
Shapiro.
yeah.
I mean,
He's like
he's
a-
never held an office. So
Right, he's like a
politically,
Rush
yes.
Limbaugh or a...
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. Rachel Maddow is another person
Yep,
who comes to mind. A person
definitely.
who just talks about political
Right. He's an
ideology.
observer and commentator
And,
on
yeah.
politics.
And so I knew that Joe Rogan I assumed it was a deep dive in the same way that it's a Mark Maron WTF. I thought they were similar formats. And they both
Right.
kind of came up at the same time. They're both comedians. And they both decided to do these kind of long form interview style podcasts. And so I assumed that it was going to be basically the same thing. And I was pleasantly surprised to find that Joe Rogan really does do a different style of podcast than a Mark Maron does.
Sure. Agreed.
In the way that he forms his arguments, in the way that he explores the content. And obviously he's picking guests because he wants them to talk about a very specific topic.
Right.
As opposed to Mark Maron, where I feel like it's more about where have you been? What are the experiences you've had in your lives? As opposed to Ben Shapiro. It's not like Ben Shapiro, tell me about your from birth to death.
Right. Where'd you go to school?
Right,
When did
doesn't
you get
care
your
about any of
star?
that
When's the
stuff.
first time you spoke on? Did you always know you wanted to talk about?
Right.
Which is probably very close to the interview you'd get with a Mark Maron. That's what he
Right.
does. And also Mark Maron tends to, other than the Obama interview, really focus on celebrities, people
Right.
who are particularly comedians and people who are there to entertain. He's much less likely to have a neurophysicist or
Right.
an astrophysicist or
Right.
a physicist.
Unless it's Neil deGrasse Tyson and he's looking for somebody who's a celebrity.
Right. Also problematic celebrity now at this point, but given enough
Celebrity
time.
nonetheless.
Sure.
What did you think of Joe? Did you have an experience with Joe Rogan, John?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, every UFC I've seen since the first UFCs that
Right.
I saw, like in the Mid-90s, yes.
But did you feel like that gave you some insight into who Joe Rogan was?
That's a good question. If it was just his color commentary in the UFC, other than his really excellent knowledge of at least the core martial arts that make up MMA,
Right.
I wouldn't have that great an idea. But over the last few years, particularly 2017, which was such a tough year that I found myself really more than I ever have, and certainly more than I have since, looking up stuff that was about self-betterment, and I was really focused even more
journey.
than I normally am, on self-improvement and seeing the world differently and thinking meditative techniques and things that...
Did it work?
Yes, hugely.
Oh, excellent.
I'm an incredibly enlightened person now.
That's excellent.
You guys can't tell, but I'm floating an inch off of my chair.
Yeah, it is quite actually unnerving. I
Yes,
really wish you'd stop.
I'm doing it because it's freaking you guys
I don't like
the
it.
hell out.
I don't like it.
And because of that,
You gotta. You know what it is? It's because your balls dangle, and I don't like
Right.
seeing them just hang down
so
so low.
it's not that I'm just an inch off my chair, but that I'm pantsless an inch
Yeah,
off my
I
chair.
mean, because it's an audio medium, I thought maybe I'd
Brent,
save that for myself.
Now that I'm
but-
getting that feedback, it probably should be one or the other. And you're right, and I apologize. Because YouTube will be like, you liked this, check this out. And I think because, again, he is a guy that you will hear talking about Jungian psychology or
Right.
Campbellian archetypes. Little bits of his podcast, because they're now video recorded as well. He's just
Right.
all over media. Kept coming up in my feed, like 5 minutes of Joe Rogan talking about this, or
Yes.
talking to this MMA practitioner about training or but whatever it happened to be,
And-
just kind of personal betterment. And so then I got a feel for he's really experimental with drugs. That's a big thing for him.
Right.
I got a feel for that kind of libertarian side to the guy. So I felt going into this because of all those little bits that I saw.
Right.
And I was like you, I'd never actually listen to a full
And that
episode.
was one of the things that you say that I did actually. I have every so often some YouTube clip will come where he's talking about SoundCloud rappers, or he's talking to
Right.
somebody about
Weirdly
something.
enough, I saw one where he was talking about
And
Takeshi 69.
They'll be like 5 or 10 minute long clips, and I don't know if you've
Right.
seen these, Doug.
I have not.
Okay, but yeah, every once in a while he'll show up on YouTube because something he talked about will be cut down into small pieces
Sure.
and then disseminated to the internets. And it, I was surprised listening to the Joe Rogan Experience at how seemingly curious and I don't know if wise is the right word, but definitely more cerebral than I expected him to be on these different topics. I didn't think of him as necessarily a lunkhead, although he does present sort of as a lunkhead kind of.
He does.
Fighter.
Our good friend Cyrus, have to attribute this to him because I think he's both right. And let me say in advance, this is going to sound more critical of Joe Rogan than it's meant to. But
Okay.
Cyrus said, as we were talking about his huge popularity, I mean, it is worth mentioning that this is a guy who gets 30 million plus downloads a month.
Wow.
He is currently,
And he does put out maybe 30,000 shows in a month.
Sure, it's a huge
numbers
amount
game.
of content, but we could also do that, and we would not be getting
Not
30
30 million?
Yeah, like maybe 15 million, but not 30 million.
John, thank you.
You're welcome. And this is also a guy who, right now, if you check the iTunes top list, which is basically their top 10 most downloaded, has nothing to do with critical review. His last 2 episodes, his most recent, are currently number 1 and number 4. He appears twice. Out of all the universe of hundreds, thousands of podcasts, he's occupying 2 of the top 10 positions.
Sure.
So when I say it's a behemoth, this is a behemoth. And Cyrus and I, again, a friend of ours, someone known to everybody at this table, we were talking one day about why is he so popular. And he said, and again, it's going to sound more critical, and I know what Cyrus meant. He's the smartest dumb guy you know.
Sure.
Or he's like an incredibly inquisitive frat guy or bro.
Right.
And in many ways, that is really true. Not that he's not an unintelligent guy, not that he is actually a dumb guy,
Right.
but he kind of presents it as, hey, I'm an everyman. I have a little bit of information. This is where I'm coming from. What do you think of this? Or tell me about that.
Right.
I've noticed in the list, other than, some people in entertainment with him and some people, of course, in MMA, the 2 categories seem to be people he can ask questions of and be like, what do you think of this? What does this mean? What's this all about? I've heard something about it. Or other people who are also questioners and seekers.
Sure.
And I think that's true of both of these guests. We have 2 guys who are questioning the system in which they're in. Maybe to different extents or arriving at very different conclusions.
Sure.
With different goals. But I guess that means we should start with like Ben Shapiro. Who is this guy, and